this is DrumWise Meets. Today, I'm here with John DeChristopher. He's worked for several big drum manufacturers and he currently plays for his band Grand Theft Audio. Hi, John.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
What age did you start drumming? And when you started, what bands or artists inspired you?
Okay, well, I started playing at age 11, and that was during the summer of 1972. So during that time, it was really all British bands that influenced me early on. It was, of course, the Beatles when I was really little, before I was a drummer, but made me interested in music. By the time I really got interested in playing at age 11, it was the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watts. I mean, they were like the band that I listened to most, but also John Bonham with Led Zeppelin and Keith Moon with The Who and Mitch Mitchell with Jimi Hendrix and Ian Pace with Deep Purple. I mean, all those drummers at that early stage were my biggest influences, for sure.
Good stuff. And can you remember your first drum set?
Yes, my first drum set. So I turned 12 at the end of that year, 1972. And my birthday is the week before Christmas. So I got, as a combined gift, my first drum set, which was from the Sears catalog, which Sears was a big department store here in the States. And you could buy anything. Of course, they had musical instruments. So my dad sent away for this Blue Sparkle 5-piece Sears drum set. And that was my kit up until my first sort of professional, real drum set, which was a Gretsch drum set in 1974. But I played that Sears kit for the first 2 years of being a drummer.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
And a question I've asked a few people, do you still have it?
I don't. I wish I did. I knew you were going to ask me that. And, it's one of those things everybody regrets, but I'll just say I came upon something that was really similar a few years ago, and I regret not buying it at the time. It was pretty beat up, but it was of the same vintage, the same Blue Sparkle, and very reminiscent of what I had. And I just didn't have the energy at that time to sort of take on, buying a kind of a cheap drum set and trying to fix it up, and so, yeah.
Well, we've all got things that we regret selling, hey?
Yeah.
I think probably most drummers sell off their first drum kit. I've interviewed a few guys who said, yeah, I sold it, but then I bought it back several years later, and that's like, wow, how did you manage to do that? But
I know, yeah. That's luck.
So obviously you've worked with a lot of drummers, with what you've done in the past, and we'll come to that in a bit. But you've mentioned a couple of influences, but if you had to pick just one, I know this is an impossible question for some people, who would be your all-time favorite drummer?
Well, a couple of years ago, that would have been a hard question for me, but I've sort of come to the point where I'm full circle, and I would say my most, the guy that influenced me the most back then, and to this day, I'm most, inspired by is Charlie Watts. I just love Charlie. I love his style. I love his sound. I love all those, the older Stones records, older meaning like the stuff from the 70s, 60s and 70s. I know him, he's a friend, and that sort of adds to it in terms of just really, he's like the whole package to me, you know what I mean? It's just, it's his style, it's his uniqueness, his sensibility with never playing too much, always playing for the song, always playing the right part. To me, it's the essence of what a drummer's job really is.
That's a conversation I've had with a lot of people actually, because it seems today that some people have kind of lost the whole point of drums. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to be able to juggle 5 sticks at the same time and breathe fire, but because obviously that's part of it, being a showman. But I think that's the thing, isn't it? You listen to drummers like Charlie, and playing for the song is such an important thing.
Yeah. And I'll just, and I know I've given you my answer, and I don't want to you know, make a long answer longer, but there are many other drummers that I think fit that mold that are huge influences to this day. But I mean, when you ask me who my absolute favorite is, I land on Charlie, and then you know, there's a whole bunch of other guys that fit that category that I listen to all the time that are influential.
Yeah, and again, something I've talked to people a lot about is, yeah, I don't really like that question because I don't feel like I could answer it very well myself. But it's not, it's not meant to be easy. But
Yeah,
because yeah, we really have tons of influences that make us like the drummer or the musician that we are today, don't we? So yeah,
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
I'm with you
yeah.
there. Now, what's been the highlight of your career so far? Now, obviously, I know you've got a slightly different career to a lot of the guys that I've interviewed who just play full time. You've obviously got the sort of like the business background as
Mm,
well. So thinking maybe like an overall and then maybe like a playing highlight as well.
sure, yeah. Um, well, business wise, you know, I spent the most time working at Zildjian. I was there, as I said, you know, 24 years. So I think I made my biggest impact there. Um, in terms of a career, I feel like I have many career highlights, and maybe some of the bigger ones are some events that I produced to pay tribute to Steve Gadd in 2003, where we did something here in Boston at Berklee College of Music, where we had James Taylor's band, basically the rhythm section. Steve, of course, playing drums. Paul Simon was there. Rick Marotta and Vinnie Colaiuta were also performing as kind of to pay tribute to Steve. We also paid tribute to the late Armin Zildjian, who had passed away just 6 months before, and he was a very dear friend. So that was a highlight, and I put that whole show together. It's available on a DVD through Hudson Music, and then 5 years later, we did a similar tribute to Ginger Baker at Shepherd's Bush in London, and unfortunately it was in December of 2008. It was right when the economy just really kind of fell off a cliff, just a couple of months before that. So it wasn't to the same scale as the one that we'd done for Steve in Boston. But what I say that only in terms of just, it wasn't as big a venue perhaps, but it was certainly as great an event. And we had Charlie Watts presented the award to Ginger. We had performances by Simon Phillips and Steve White. Keith Carlock all paid tribute to Ginger, playing. Jack Bruce was playing bass with Ginger. And the house band was made up of Tony Levin and on bass, and as I say, Simon and Keith and Steve White, and it was amazing. It was a great show. So I hope I'm not leaving anybody out that was there, but
Yeah, they're pretty good highlights. And what about from your playing? What sort of gigs really stick in your memory?
So I started off playing in a band when I was like 13, and I played with the same sort of nucleus of the band into my 20s. And at one point, by our late teens, we started to write our own music, and we started to record some of it. And you start playing those gigs where you're playing clubs on a Tuesday night. I don't know how it works in London, but in those days you start at the bottom, so you're playing at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, hoping you're going to get some people to see you. And we got to a point where by the early 80s, some of our music had been played on the local radio stations. We were working a lot, getting hired a lot as an original band, and we still played some covers, but had a couple of really big, college gigs where we'd have like, 500, 700 people, and, just sort of building our own following. And so, I think of those as great playing highlights. By the time I got to my mid-20s is when I moved out to Los Angeles looking for sort of brighter horizons in playing, and that led me to working in the industry, which I can get to later if you want to talk more about that. But it was just I sort of transitioned from the band that I had here had really sort of run its course after all that time. People were wanting to do different things, and I felt like I think if I'm going to try to really pursue drumming, I need to move to Los Angeles. That's really kind of where the scene is. And you know, and of course there are no other drummers out in Los Angeles. I say that sarcastically, which, you know, I mean, I knew going out there what it would be like, but it was a, you know, a real sort of, you know, eye opener when I did finally get there and realize what that scene was like to try to break into. But I have no regrets at all about that. I mean, that's what established me in the drum industry, was moving out to LA and getting a job out there. But I will say, since getting out of the corporate side of it and getting back into playing again with my band Grand Theft Audio, it's, you know, playing in front of 100 people is even more rewarding to me these days than what I felt, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, playing in front of 500 people. So I'm gonna have some water.
That's cool.
It's dry here. Just from the standpoint of how much fun I'm having doing it now, and you know, as we get older, we really appreciate what we have, and especially now with kind of how it is for bands to get work. There, you know, there's not as many venues as there used to be, and you know, gigs are kind of, for a lot of bands, few and far between, and we're lucky to work as much as we do. I'm just, you know, notwithstanding the lockdown that we're in right now, but right up until March, we were working every week and booked right through, you know, till now. So, and I'm hoping that's going to resume next year whenever we can find our way out of this. But my point being that it's, you know, I remember going to gigs back, you know, in my 20s, dreading going to a gig because I'd had 3 gigs the night, you know, the prior 3 nights, and I'm just tired and, you know, not enthusiastic. And now it's like I have a whole new appreciation for it.
Have you ever had anything go wrong on stage that you've had to recover from? And
Oh yeah.
I mean, like, you know, like, not just like dropping a stick, but like, you know, some like serious stuff.
Yeah. I've you know, way back when, in my much younger days, I used to play really hard, and I've one time the nut on top of my felt beater came loose. So the felt came off the metal stem, if you can picture that, went right through the bass drum head. That happened. I had to change the head out. I think I managed to get through the set, and by some miracle, I think I was able to tape it up. I broke a footboard on an old DW pedal. I had one of the first left-footed DW pedals they ever made, and this was around 1982, 83, and I broke the footboard on my primary pedal one time on a gig. Yeah, and I managed to finish it by playing the auxiliary pedal with my other foot, which wasn't any, you know, it wasn't any great sounding bass drum playing by any means. But I mean, almost anything you can think of. I've broken cymbals. I've broken snare bottom heads. I'm just trying to think. When I played my Simmons electronic kit, I blew out my stage monitor, my speakers that I had my drums, you know, coming through for stage monitors. And, you know, so the rest of the gig, I couldn't hear them. They were coming through the house fine, but I literally it was like, you know, all night. And it was the most,
really off-putting.
Yeah. Just those are some examples. But
now, talking about, you brought that around quite nicely. Talking about DW and Simmons there.
I do have one other story. Sorry, I just thought of something else.
Go for it.
Sorry, and maybe this isn't really appropriate for this, but I was just recently in February on a band with Grand Theft Audio. I was very, very ill, which I've never been at a gig before, where I literally had to get up from behind the drums and go to the bathroom. And so anyway, you can edit that out if you want, but that's something that I literally, I said to the guys, I gotta go. I told them beforehand that I was not feeling well. And so anyway, please go on.
Oh dear. So you mentioned a couple of companies there that you later went on to work for. So you mentioned DW, Simmons, and of course you were vice president of Zildjian. and you were there, as you say, for 24 years. So talk to us a little bit about your career with those companies and kind of how you got into it, and what I suppose what life is kind of like behind the scenes of those companies, really, because I think a lot of drummers maybe don't realize kind of what goes on.
Mm. Well, so when I got the job at Simmons, it was through meeting a man named Glenn Thomas, who had moved to the States from London to open up a U.S. distribution for Simmons. And I was working at a drum shop at the time when I met him, and he came in and did a demonstration on Simmons. This was in 1982. And I'll cut a long story short. We became friends. We bought this kit, this SDS-5 from him on the condition that he would come and demo it for us, and which he did do. And that night at the clinic that he put on, the drummer for the Cars, the band The Cars, was in the audience. They had a studio across the street, and he was a customer. David Robinson was a customer. So the next day after Glenn did the clinic, Glenn and I went out afterward and really got to know each other. He's this very sweet man, and we really sort of hit it off. So the next day, David Robinson from the Cars came in with his drum tech, and we fooled around with the kit for about an hour or so in the drum department. And what little I sort of remembered, and he was pretty intuitive because he had already been using a lot of electronics. And long story short is he bought the kit really on the spot. So Glenn got word of that and said, "So I heard the Cars bought, the 5. Are you going to order another one?" So we ordered another one, and this began this relationship that we developed. And so anyway, when I started thinking about moving to LA, I contacted him as someone that I thought, well, if I had to work somewhere, I'd love to work for him in that company. And at that time in 1985, it was, really booming. The electronic drum business was it was what was happening. So we had a couple of phone calls, and his initial response was, we're expanding, business is growing, and we could use a good guy like you. So if you come out here, I'll figure something out. I'll find something for you. So I kind of put that away for the moment. And a month or so later, maybe I had really decided I was going to make this move. And I called him and I said, "I'm really serious about this. I don't want to pressure you, but I mean, would you really have a job for me?" I wanted to be able to land on my feet when I got there. I didn't want to just go out there and spend my savings trying to, scuffle around trying to be a drummer. So he basically said, if you come out here, you'll have a job. So I did. And he literally hired me the day or a couple of days after I got there. And I started off working in a bunch of different jobs within the company. I eventually settled down in sales because that was what my background had been, working in a drum shop, and I knew the product well. But I started off like working in artist relations. I didn't really have that sort of position. It was just different people would work with different drummers when they came in. And because I really wasn't assigned to a certain place, if, Vinny Colaiuta came in or Chad Wackerman or someone needed something demoed or fixed or swapped out, I would do it. And I became, pretty comfortable with that. Just, the first few times that I met some of these guys, it was pretty daunting when you meet your heroes. Use an example of Vinny as an example of someone that, is pretty, humbling when you meet these guys. And within the first few weeks of being there, I met Vinny and Chad Wackerman and Chester Thompson and John Robinson and Jerry Brown and Greg Bissonette, Myron Grombacher, all these guys that are now my good friends. But, at that time, these guys were like, heavy duty heroes. I don't know if I mentioned Danny Serafin, who was in the band Chicago at the time. So, it was just sort of a regular occurrence for these guys to come in. And then I moved over to sales, as I said, and I worked there for about a year and 2 or 3 months. And during that time, so by the sort of summer of 1986, after about a year or so of being there, business had started to kind of slow down a little bit for Simmons. They had competition from Roland and Yamaha with electronic kits that had some innovations that were a little bit ahead of what Simmons had been doing, even though Simmons was the sort of, the company that sort of brought it all to market. You had, like better feeling pads that Roland was making, and maybe a little better tracking that Simmons eventually caught up to. But initially these other companies were able to get their foot in the door because of some of these innovations, and not to mention their distribution. You had big dealers that basically had to take these drums in order to keep selling Roland keyboards and Yamaha keyboards. And I knew this because I'd call on West LA Music and some of these bigger stores around Los Angeles, and they'd say, well, we have to carry these drums because, if we want to sell Yamaha DX7s, we have to carry Yamaha electronic drums. And, and a lot of their endorsers, Yamaha drum endorsers, called and said, well, we can't really play Simmons anymore. Now we've got to play the Yamaha ones, So, things had started to change. And around that time, I had met Don Lombardi, who's the founder of Drum Workshop. I had met him at a drum clinic somewhere along the way in Los Angeles. And, we were friendly. We'd see each other around. And, DW in those days was basically a pedal company and a hi-hat pedal. They didn't even make cymbal stands yet, let alone drums. Well, they did make drums, but they were really, sort of a custom situation where they sold, direct to people. They didn't really have a dealer network. They certainly weren't known for their drums, but they were good drums, obviously. So anyway, I got a call from Don one night. I don't even know how he got my number, but he called me at home one night, and he started telling me that, we're going to really get serious about getting into the market with acoustic drums. And this was like August or September of '86. And he said, we want to introduce them at Winter NAMM in January. And we're looking for someone who can do artist relations, sales, kind of, wear a lot of hats. We're going to be a small organization. And, your name was mentioned to me, or I thought of you. And is it something you'd be interested in doing? And I thought, at the time we were expecting my son, my first child. And so it was certainly something to think about. And I agreed to go up to the original factory in Newbury Park, California, and after work one night to meet with him. And so it was just, Don sort of walked me around and showed me this little shop, where they made the drums, where they made the hardware, where they assembled a lot of the stuff. I didn't meet John Good, but he told me about John, and I think I knew who he was. But John at that time was really mainly a drum tech that worked for a bunch of well-known drummers like Chad Wackerman and Jonathan Moffett, and was a great drum builder, but had really made his living as a one of the top drum techs around LA. So what Don was basically trying to do is get his ducks in a row and say, I need to build a team here so that I need somebody that can help sell these drums, so that I have a guy that I can afford to pay to make these drums, So it all went hand in hand, and we talked about it, and I just felt like, this is probably going to be my best situation, my best move at this point. I don't really know what's going to happen with Simmons. A few people had been let go at Simmons. Being in the sales department, I probably would have been one of the last guys to be let go. But I don't know. Things were changing, and I had to really think about my future. So the hard part was telling my boss, Glenn Thomas, that I was going to be leaving, and he was great. He was, he's such a great guy, and we're still friends to this day. We keep in touch, and he completely understood. And he said, look, you got a child on the way, and you've got to do the right thing, what's best for you. And I understand. And it's, he's such a good man. And even in just a year and a few months working for him, I learned a lot from him, just, in terms of, being a good leader, just a good, smart businessman. So I took the job with DW, and around October, November of that year, and we launched DW Drums in January of '87. And that was, pretty interesting times. I mean, it was literally, a really small operation. It was Don, a woman that ran the sort of office that answered the phone, did some accounting, myself and John Good, and the guys that worked in the factory making the pedals, assembling the pedals. But, it was we all wore a lot of hats. Eventually Don's son, Chris, came in. He graduated high school that summer of '87 and came to work for me, actually, which is just kind of funny. When we see each other, we laugh about how, I was his boss. He's now the CEO of the company. Don is basically the chairman, and Chris runs the company day to day. But, Chris, he's very kind, and says, I owe it all to you, and I say, you can't blame me for, don't try to blame me. But, or it's a classic, I want all the credit and none of the blame. But they're a great bunch of people. And I will just say, Don and I spoke with him the other day in regular contact. And he used to, like, when I'd see him at NAMM shows, I'd go visit the booth and say hello and, hang out with him a little bit. And he'd put his arm around me and introduce me to somebody maybe there that I didn't know. He'd say, John here, he's a bigwig now over at Zildjian, but, he worked for me. That's, I helped get him his start, and the best thing he ever did was leave, because as soon as he left, our business just exploded overnight. So, he's a very funny guy. But so another great, mentor and friend that I learned a lot from. And I talk about someone that built a company from the ground up. I mean, him and John really started in Don's garage and making snare drums and assembling double pedals, and, to see what they've become today is pretty amazing. And I am so happy for them.
Yeah, I mean, I use DW pedals, on all the teaching kits, and just what fantastic hardware. I mean, I've never owned a DW kit, but
No, they're not. I haven't either. It's funny. He offered me a kit when I left. When I left, and I wasn't really playing much at that time, and I kind of just kept putting it off. And I'll get to that. Then I went to work for Zildjian, and I had this old Gretsch set, that green aquamarine kit that you see up in the corner there. It's a round badge 60s Gretsch kit that I bought when I moved back to Boston from LA. And I was kind of playing that a little bit, but my son really became a budding drummer at age 4 or 5. So
cool.
He started playing those drums. I bought him a little Remo kit, and then he really started playing those drums. And then at one point when he got to be, I want to say around, how old was he? Maybe 11 or 12. He said, Dad, I want a DW set. He saw, all these other, his heroes, his favorite drummers, like, the usual story. And he, so they were kind enough to send. Don said to me, well, you never got a kit, so how about if we give your son the kit that we would have given you? And I said, wow, that would be amazing. So they gave him this probably, I don't know, $5,000 drum set that he still has, and he still plays. And he's now, he's 33, and he has 2 kids, and he has one of my drum sets too, one of my Gretsch vintage sets too. But,
awesome.
But anyway, so I'll, if you want, Tom, I'll just continue with how it evolved to go from DW to Zildjian, if that makes sense to continue. So my son was born out in Los Angeles in 1987, and was working for DW. And at a point around a year and a half or so after he was born, my first wife and I, kind of just made the decision to move back to Boston, to be back where our families were from, so he could know his family. We were jetting back and forth all the time, and it was just getting to be a little too much. And it was really kind of like our hearts were really back here. We wanted to be back home. So, and I knew that I sort of put it off as long as I could, really discussing it with Don, because I really didn't want to leave DW, but I kind of felt like, well, I don't really know what else I can do here. But Don came up with this idea, or maybe it was both of us together, but I feel like it was his idea to basically say, why don't we have you set up an East Coast office and we'll have you be DW's East Coast arm, and you can you can service stores in New England, Boston and the area that I live in, but also travel to New York and other, bigger cities on the East Coast. So it was a really great situation. And it became from a business standpoint, I was no longer officially employed by DW. I was an independent sales rep, which meant I could sell other products that didn't conflict with DW, which is a great situation, which is what any good sales job is. If you work in the drum industry, if you can get a job where you're selling 3 or 4 big lines, and that's much better than working for one company. Even if they're paying for your medical and your benefits, you certainly in the good old days, you can make a whole lot more money selling, Remo drum heads and, Zildjian cymbals and Drum Workshop drums. And, so anyway, so I moved back to Boston and began this situation where I was an independent rep, and things were starting to happen, and being on the East Coast made a big difference as far as traveling to these stores. I learned that I could sell a lot more gear if I physically visited these stores and came in and helped them do inventory and made my presence felt. And that's, any good salesman will tell you that you'll be more successful if you have a face-to-face interaction with the dealer versus trying to do it all by telephone. Yeah. So I started to see the benefits of that, and fast forward to so that was the end of 88 that I moved back to Boston. Fast forward to January 89, I'm back in Los Angeles for the NAMM show. Don brought me out there, and I'm working the DW booth, and I just take a stroll around the NAMM show to just say hello to some of my friends in the business. And I happened to go by the Zildjian booth, and I saw Lenny DiMuzio, who, rest his soul, an old friend that worked there, and a friend of mine, Colin Schofield, also a Brit, who had relocated to the States. And I'd met Colin when I lived in Los Angeles, and he worked for Zildjian in the LA office that Zildjian had at the time. We had met and became friendly with each other, and then he moved to Boston to the main office. And so I think I probably bumped into him one time or another. And so I went by the booth, and he said, so yeah, you're back in Boston now. Tell me what you're doing? And I told him what I was doing. And he said, well, do you have a resume with you? And I said, yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, so I took it out of my little briefcase, and he said, we're looking to expand, and we actually, your name came up, and we'd be interested and if you'd be interested in coming down for an interview, we'd like to talk with you. And I said, well, what is it that you have in mind? And he said, well, and I remember this, he was very cagey. He said, really better to do that in person rather than get into it here. And I said, okay, sure. So, I'd given him my resume and had my phone number. So I got a phone call maybe, I don't know, a week or two later. And then when I got home from that trip, I found out we were expecting our second child, my daughter, who was born 7 or 8 months later. And so I got that phone call from Colin, and he said, right, so here's the situation. Lenny DiMuzio, who I just mentioned, my dear old friend, who was their artist relations man from the 60s on, is going to be moving over to education. So we need someone to come in and be a, artist relations manager, kind of day-to-day, kind of service that program. And I said, oh, okay. I was kind of hoping it would be sales, to be honest. I thought, like, if I had Zildjian and I had Drum Workshop and I had a couple other small accessory lines that I was selling and making a few bucks with. So I kind of had started to count my chickens a little bit, Do you use that expression in the UK? Yeah, count your chickens before they hatch? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. I mean, I hadn't really thought about artist relations. And it's a funny thing to think about, because I think probably most of your students and most people would think that's the dream job. That's the ideal job. But with 2 kids, I'm thinking I want a job that's going to pay me a lot of money, but and you have to think that way, when you have kids. But so I went down and I went down for the interview, met with him, and we talked more about it. And I had never been to the Zildjian factory, though I'd grown up, not far from it. I just had never been down there. I'd been invited, but just never had the opportunity to make that work. So I took a walk around and met some people that I hadn't met before, and I saw the operation and I liked it. And so I became interested in it. And I said, I've got this DW thing now that it's starting to happen. I've been 2.5 years now and really helping build it, and it's really going to start to go. I'm feeling it starting to go. So I really have to think about this. And I think the way we left it was Colin said, well, why don't you, we want to have you come back and meet Armin Zildjian. That's, you'd have to pass that test. And I thought, okay, it gives me something to think about. So in the meantime, I got a phone call from this sales manager from a company called HSS, which was the US distributor for Sabian cymbals, which, as I'm sure you know, they're a Canadian company, and they're the offshoot of Zildjian, their biggest competitor. And certainly at that time, I mean, it was the rivalry was like nothing you could imagine. And I think it probably still is, but not quite to that degree. But in those days, it was like, they were, the two brothers had split. It was still the nerves, everything was still very fresh. So I got a phone call from this guy who, just the company that distributes Sabian, and they were looking for a sales rep for New England. And my name had been thrown into the hat. So it was just a total cold call. I did not, put my name in the hat, so to speak. So I didn't let on anything about Zildjian, and I said, I'd be interested, but I do rep DW. And he said, yeah, well, I heard that. And if you did get this job, you'd have to resign DW because you'd be selling Sonar drums. And I said, oh boy, great drums, no doubt, very expensive in the States, and kind of a hard sell, frankly, is what I was thinking. To take nothing away from the quality of the drums, they're great drums, but I sold them in a drum shop, retail, and you had a very specific customer who bought those drums. He was willing to spend all that money for those drums. And that's not every customer. DW drums were expensive too, but not that expensive. And there was all this momentum and kind of mojo happening with DW now. So anyway, it just was put a little bit of a wrinkle in it. So we left it that he was going to be coming up to Boston in a few weeks, and he wanted to sort of set up his appointments at the airport, and just sort of touching base with me to see if I'd be interested. So I said, well, yeah, let's talk closer to when you come up here, and I'll see if I'm around, if I'm going to be, where I'm going to be and whatever. So in the meantime, I went down and had my interview with Armin Zildjian, and we hit it off. I'd met him before, but I didn't really know him. He didn't know me. And I just immediately loved the guy. I mean, I just loved him till the day he died. And he was just funny and charming and warm. And, I could tell he liked me, and we really hit it off. We were talking about drummers that we knew, and, do you know Greg Bissonette? Do you know Steve Gadd? What do you think of this guy? And at one point, his daughter, Craigie, who you might know, she now runs the company. She's the owner of the company now, later became my boss. She was the human resources person. So she's looking at my resume and asking asking the tough questions, which is what, you have to do. And so at one point she said, well, I want to just ask this question. I see you've moved around. You lived in Boston, then you moved to Los Angeles and working for one company, then you went to another company, and then you moved back here. And, it's a lot of moving around in 5 years and 4 years. And how do we know that you're not going to just leave and, and go work somewhere else? And I said, no, that's a fair question. I said, I moved out there to pursue drumming, and, I got hooked up with Simmons, and that kind of got my foot in the door and launched my career, so to speak, in the industry. And then it was a step up to go to DW, where I technically am now. And, moving back here was to be closer to our families. I mean, I gave her honest answers, and Armin just kind of interrupted her and said, Craigie, for crying out loud, I like this guy. Just hire him and give him whatever he wants. So, it was like a, I knew I'd passed the test with Armin. So that was pretty great. And we just had to hammer out the sort of compensation, to be really honest with you. And that's, again, from the standpoint of working in the industry, that's something that I would tell any young person getting into it, that I was fortunate to have, I was a known commodity, so to speak. They seeked me out, and I wasn't somebody that answered an ad, so I had a lot more leverage, you could say, in terms of negotiating my salary. They offered me a number that I just flatly said no to. I just said, no, I can't. I said, I can't work for that kind of money. If I'm going to be, a wholly owned employee, and this is going to be my job and all that I make, this is what I'm making now. Potentially I could make a whole lot more than that. So I'm not going to, so we went back and forth, and that took about a week or more. And I want to say there was even a discussion where they were saying, well, then, we're going to maybe look at some other people. And I said, I understand, and I was honest. I said, I want the job. I'd be disappointed if I didn't get it, but I'm not going to accept it under those terms. So it was a little bit of a waiting game. And in the meantime, I'd had one more call from the guy from HSS/Sabian saying, well, I'm looking to be up there at the end of the month, which was maybe 2 weeks from that time. And I kind of let him on, and I said, yeah, I think I'm going to be around, we didn't set a date, but let's, I'm not proud of that, but I had to sort of hedge the bet, play the game. And I said, let's talk maybe a few days before, and we'll nail it down. And he was fine with that. So anyway, I finally came to terms with Zildjian in terms of the negotiations, and reached an agreement. And, that was pretty much a done deal. I had confided in Don Lombardi what I was doing. I felt like I didn't want to leave Don hanging. So I wanted to give him an opportunity to maybe start thinking about, I said, look, if these things don't pan out, I'm not going anywhere. I want to keep doing what I'm doing, but I just want to give you a heads up, because I might only be able to give you a few weeks notice if I end up taking this job with Zildjian. Whatever I was going to do, I was going to try to, take as much time as I could to transition so that Don wouldn't be left hanging. And he appreciated that. And Don actually said to me, look, if you want, I'll call the people at HSS and tell them I have no problem with you selling Sonar and DW, that I don't see it as a conflict of interest having two drum lines. And so I did say that to the guy at HSS, and he said, no, you would only be selling Sonar if we hire you. So anyway, I finally, after I'd taken accepted the position with Zildjian, I called the guy at HSS and said, look, I'm not going to be able to meet with you. I've just accepted a job with Zildjian. And he was not happy. He said, are you kidding me? And I said, no. I said, I didn't want to waste your time. I didn't want to obviously, meet with you and waste your time and then tell you. I wanted to give you enough, a week's notice or whatever it was. And he was kind of, the nature of the rivalry and the competitiveness between these two companies made it so that he was a little aggravated and not happy. But years later, and the industry's so small, we actually became friendly, and the company doesn't exist anymore, and I think he's long retired. So anyway, that was that. I mean, that was a long story. So feel free to edit all that out if you like.
It's a good story. And obviously you spent quite a long time at Zildjian. Something I'm quite keen to ask you about on behalf of, I think, let's say the younger drumming generation. I think a lot of people these days are really caught up in like endorsements and, I'm endorsed by this company, and obviously it's great to be able to say that you work with these companies, but I think that's the first thing that people get wrong.
Right.
And it's actually amazing how many drummers say it wrong as well. I'm endorsed by,
Yeah.
you know, so
Thank you. Yeah, I have a real problem with that too.
yeah. So can you talk to us about kind of how endorsements work for drummers? I suppose specifically for drummers, and um, I suppose what the drummer needs to bring to the company, because I think
Hmm.
a lot of people think it's a one-way street. Oh, I'm gonna, my band are doing really well. They're gonna give me loads of free cymbals. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Sure. No,
because like
there's
from
a,
my point of view, I work quite closely with Active Distribution in the UK, who distribute Ludwig drums, and I've been a
Mhm.
Ludwig endorsee for a few years now, and it's one of the best decisions I ever made. I absolutely love their drums, and more, I love the support they give me, and I fully try to fly the flag for Ludwig. Every opportunity I can, there will
That's
be
great.
some sort of promotion for Ludwig, and the same for Roland as well, because it's difficult because DrumWise is kind of Roland,
Mhm.
for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Drum school kind of makes sense to have loads of electronic kits. But for me personally, obviously, I wouldn't rock up to a gig with this. Although it depends what the gig is, of course. That said. But anyway, sorry. Back to my question. Kind of how does it work? How do endorsements work? And what does the drummer need to bring to the table for the company? So let's say Zildjian.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that, you know, disclaimer that I've been away from it for 7 years now, and I do think it's changed. It was changing before I left, but I think some of the criteria has changed since I've left there. Just not just at Zildjian, I think just in the industry, but I think also at Zildjian. But I will just say that from my time there, and I started at the manager level and then moved up, as you said, to vice president. And you mentioned Tommy Igo earlier. Tommy was the first artist I signed in the summer of 1989. And I'll tell that story in a second, but it's basically the whole, and you've hit the nail on the head, Tom. I mean, the whole um, philosophy behind endorsements is to promote products. So whether it's Ludwig or it's Roland or it's Zildjian or it's Gretsch, um, I mean, ideally, companies want to sign artists that are going to maximize exposure and and promotional benefit for their brand, and truly, as we call it a two-way street, we call it a reciprocal situation, but it has to be slanted really more to the manufacturer. I mean, and it just, and I think it's the responsibility of artist relations people, managers, to make that clear from the beginning that it can't be, unless you're Taylor Hawkins or you're Dave Grohl or,
Yeah.
um, you know, you've got to you've got to accept the fact that your primary role as an endorser of a company is to promote that product. They're looking at you to, whether it's overtly, directly holding up the product in a uh, in a Facebook video chat, or just having, using it on stage, or in your case where you've got students and you're exposing your students to the products that you endorse, and they love the sound of your drums, or they love the the products that you use, and that influences their decision to then buy them. um, but it's never, how can I say this in a tactful way so it doesn't sound harsh and cold, but it's not about um, a company really supporting an artist to the level that the artist really is supposed to support the company. Um, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried to really maybe simplify that too much, but and Steve Gadd or Vinny Colaiuta would be another example of somebody that would be able to expect, but here's the catch to that is none of those guys really expect anything. The guys at the very top of the chain, food chain, are the guys that ask for the least amount of stuff. You've probably heard this, and it's true. I mean, they really are the guys that are the least demanding. The ones that you would kind of feel like, okay, if Steve Gadd asked for 10 sets of cymbals, I'd send them to him because he's Steve Gadd, and you know, I mean, that's a really crazy hypothetical, but but yet there are in my day, there were drummers that would ask for multiple sets of cymbals for multiple kits, and kind of expect it. And these were bands that were, touring, and well-known bands, but certainly not big enough bands to expect that kind of, expect it for free, basically. But there was a period of time where when business was good for a lot of companies, not just Zildjian, but for everybody, there was a lot of free gear going out the door to people. Drummers were they were writing in their contracts, getting a free kit every year, a new, I got it in my deal that I'm going to get a new kit every year. And I used to think, why, why would you? I mean, if you're going to send the old kit back, that's one thing. And I think some companies do have that. They stipulate you've got to send your old kit back. But to just accumulate, I mean, I say that I've accumulated many drum sets, but I bought all these sets. They're all vintage drum sets that I like to look at. I couldn't imagine asking a drum company, to send me, just because it's a different color,
That's it. I think a lot of people these days, when I talk to students about endorsements, when it comes up, which isn't that often, but when people ask about it, I think they assume that they're just, if you have an endorsement with a company, you are going to just get a free drum kit. But obviously, I'd be interested to see if you agree with kind of my analogy, if that's the right word. I say to them, like, there's three levels to an endorsement. There's God, that's Dave Grohl. there's Jesus. I don't know, that I can't think of a name for who that would be. And then there's your local priest. and like, I'm the local priest. So, I get a nice discount on certain things. But then obviously Jesus gets kind of, really nice. Whereas God, Dave Grohl, I'm not saying he's God, by the way. This is not meant to be linked to religion in any way. But, he gets it all for free. So Taylor Hawkins, Dave Grohl. Does that kind of sound right? Is that a good thing to be telling people?
Well, yeah, there's different levels and different, I'm going to adjust my camera, sorry. But there's different levels and different people are at those levels. And I do think it's changed in the time since I've left Zildjian in terms of how much stuff goes out. I think a lot less free stuff goes out the door. And that's, even still, there were the vast majority of endorsers that we had either paid for their equipment or they traded back old equipment for new equipment. They just didn't get a free, a free set of cymbals whenever they asked for it. It's a sort of one-for-one trade where we'd use the credit from stuff coming back, and there were ways to do that. And but it's I guess I probably even jumped ahead a little too far when I went into my whole story there about drummers getting too many free drums. But the whole concept behind, as I said, the whole concept behind endorsements is promoting that brand's products. And if you're not able to if I'm not able to do it, you're not able to do it, someone's not able to do it, then they really don't, there's really not a value to having that person as an endorser. I mean, it's kind of that simple. I used to have that conversation with people all the time when it gets to when you said, what are the things that people should be doing, or what do you tell someone when they ask that question? And it's pretty simple. It's like, are you going to help? I mean, certainly you would try to promote the product, but are you really going to affect that company's business? And I think most people, when they look at that, they realize, well, probably not. I mean, I certainly don't think I would. I don't know. I have a pretty big presence in social media, but I don't know that I'm selling a lot of product for companies. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely become a lot tougher these days. And talking about, before we move away from this, talking about your time with Zildjian, have you got any cool stories with like people that you've worked with? Because obviously, you know, through your time, you've worked with some incredible names, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of stories. That could be another, that could be a long, I mean, I did clinic tours with, Dennis Chambers. We probably did half a dozen clinic tours together over the course of the years and throughout the years. And Vinny Colaiuta and Steve Gadd, we did these Mission from Gadd tours. And I say clinic tours because those are where a lot of these stories can come from, where you're together with someone for 2 weeks at a time, and you really bond with that person, and it really, in every situation that I was ever in like that, it made my relationship with those drummers stronger, even if it was strong already. But being out on the road with somebody, if you don't kill each other, you tend to get a lot tighter. It's like, you just become buddies. You really just, you hang out, and I had a lot of great times doing that with, as I said, with guys like Dennis. And Tony Williams did one clinic tour his entire life. And I was on that with him just a few months before he died. And that was pretty amazing because it was Tony, and it was just such a special thing to be out with him. And yeah, it's funny when you say these stories. When people ask me that, I feel like a deer in the headlights, because when we're done, I'll think of 20 that I could tell.
Yeah.
But like right now, to tell one, it's like, I don't know. Let's see.
Yeah, because there's so many. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot.
No, that's cool.
There's a lot.
Now, moving away from drums for a sec. So, what are your hobbies away from drums?
I love to get out and run 5 or 6 days a week. I mean, I just try to stay fit, get out there and exercise, ride my bike. I have 2 grandchildren. My son has 2 beautiful kids that are 5 and 2. My granddaughter Fiona and my son Dylan, a grandson Dylan rather, and we haven't seen a lot of them because of the COVID situation, but we're going to see them next week. They're going to come to our place on Martha's Vineyard for 2 weeks, and then come back next month for another 10 days. So hobby being spending as much time with them as possible. And let's see, what else? My wife and I love to travel when we can travel. We had lots of travel planned this year, but it's been, obviously scrapped, shelved. But I have a big birthday coming up at the end of this year. We were going to go to Italy in October and have a little fun trip. But so that'll probably be next year.
Yeah.
What else? And I'll just say, I'm kind of overlooking this, but as we talked about offline, during the lockdown, I started doing these kinds of interviews that you're doing with some drummer friends. And it's kind of become a hobby. I just did a little live chat the other day to celebrate Ringo's birthday. It wasn't with Ringo, but it was kind of in honor of his birthday. And I'm going to send the link to his manager and have him send it to Ringo. And, maybe he'll get a kick out of it. Who knows? But yeah, it's been fun. It's something that I had sort of wanted to do when I was working at Zildjian. We had talked about something like getting, kind of having a little closer connection to the drummers and doing, and they're starting to do these now. I see a lot of the companies doing them, where they've got like somebody from artist relations talking to a drummer about, different things. And what I like about the ones that I'm doing now, and it's not to say anything negative about the way the other companies do them, is because I don't work for a company, it's not skewed toward promoting, Zildjian or a drum company or someone that I work for. It's really just me talking to Steve Gadd or talking to Rick Marotta or, um, one of the Peter Erskine or anybody like that. It's really just talking about drums, and it's not skewed in any way. It's really more organic, and I like that part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of why I came up with these, just literally just
Yeah.
inside information into
Yep.
people do, and just, yeah, totally. And my last curveball question here for you. Big one, probably the most important one. We've had some really interesting answers on this. So,
Okay.
what is your favorite cookie?
My favorite cookie. Oh man, that's a great question too. Can I just say all cookies are my favorite cookie?
No,
No,
that
I
doesn't
can't.
count.
No. You know what? I know this is probably boring, but because I love oatmeal raisin cookies, I love chocolate chip cookies, but I'm going to say just a good old chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah.
Just a good, but like a good one, like a homemade. My wife makes great, from scratch chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah. It's because over here we kind of have, it's a very different kind of thing. Obviously, you've got cookies and we've got like biscuits, but I know biscuits are a very different thing to you. But but obviously you spent a lot of time in England, didn't you? So your typical digestives and your bourbons and your custard creams and
Oh yeah. We would always make, when we'd come to London, we would always have tea somewhere. Many times at the Dorchester Hotel, not to sound fancy, but that was always a big treat to have tea at the Dorchester, and just, get completely obliterated on scones and sweets. And oh my gosh, it's the best.
For my wife's 30th a few years back, I took her to Fortnum and Mason for afternoon tea, and I mean I've had a lot of afternoon teas in my time, but that was like insane. Like the size of the biscuits and the cake, and it was just like, oh.
You know what, Tom? I've had tea at Fortnum and Mason at F&M, and it's I would say it's right alongside the Dorchester.
Okay.
And it's the Dorchester it's super fancy hotel. It's got all the trappings when you go in there, but quality wise, actually, you're absolutely right. Fortnum and Mason was outstanding, outstanding tea. Yeah.
And we were being serenaded by a grand piano in the lobby.
Yeah.
Oh, this is great.
I love that place.
So, back to a kind of final serious question here. I'm going to kind of combine two questions because I feel they're very similar questions. So, what sort of person do you think you need to be to successfully work in the music industry? And then if you could sum it up with, if you could just give one bit of advice, like what's the main bit of advice you could give to an up and coming musician or drummer?
Well, I would say the type of person, I would say to work in the drum industry or the music industry these days, it has, again, I started 35 years ago. It was very different. And it was when I left 7 years ago, it was very different. I mean, it was one of the reasons why I left was because it was changing, and I wasn't enjoying a lot of the changes, frankly. It's not a business that's really growing like it used to. In fact, I think it would be fair to say it's shrinking. So I guess what I'm saying is I would advise anyone who really wants to pursue a career in that business to go into it with their eyes wide open. And when I say that, I guess I mean realize that these days, and I don't mean to sound like a mercenary, like it's all about the money, because I'm not that sort of person. I don't feel that way, but realize that, if you've gone to college and you have a degree in business or something, you're not going to make as much money working in the drum industry as you might in some other private sector type job. And I think, for guys like you and me who have families and have kids, that's a real thing. You have to think about that. And I only say that because I know people I was very fortunate. I was able to work my way up in the company, and I did very well there. And I have only appreciation for how well I was taken care of. And but I had to start somewhere, and it was not easy. I mean, it was I wasn't making great money when I started there. I had to keep chipping away, and moving up the ladder, so to speak. But I know people that work in the industry that are frustrated because they're not making really much money, because it's a hard industry right now for these companies. So they're not giving people big pay raises or bonuses, or even if they're hiring anybody, they're not paying them, a really top wage, unless you're an MBA and you come in there with some credentials and they need you to run a company, But I think what you and I are talking about is someone that would, right out of college, or someone that's a younger person wanting to get their foot in the door at a company, and maybe a little caught up with the idea of it being, this is the best job in the world because I'm going to get to meet all these drummers. Well, there's certainly a lot to be said for that. But for me, like, that part of it got old pretty quick. When I was, my first 6 months at Zildjian, I was out every night of the week seeing drummers. When a drummer came to town, it was my job to go out. It could be a Wednesday night, and if Kenny Aronoff was playing at a club and his set was at 10 o'clock, I was there, and I use Kenny, maybe he's not a good example because I enjoyed spending time with Kenny, but oftentimes I would have to go and bring something to somebody, and I'd be working all day at the office, and I'd be out till midnight, and then back at the office the next day, and rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. I mean, did that for day after day after day. So you get to the point where going out and hanging out with, rock stars every night it really does. And you ask anybody who does this job today, and they'll tell you that part of it it gets old. It really does. The part about going out and hanging out with drummers every night, especially when you have little kids at home and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I don't mean to paint a grim picture. I'm just saying, go into it eyes wide open. Know that, there's a lot. If you're going to do the job right, and to the level that it needs to be done at, there's a lot of your own time that goes into it. I missed a lot of my kids' birthdays because I was traveling. I'd be out on one of those clinic tours, and somewhere across the country, and I'd be missing my son's 5th birthday. So, just stuff like that I do regret to this day. My son, of course, laughs and says, "Dad, get over it," really, But anyway, it's it's just those kinds of things that you should weigh out in your in your mind, to just know that it's something you really want to get yourself into. One bit of advice. Let's see. I mean, I would say, really, be the best person you can be. And that probably goes back to the part about, what does it take to work in the industry? But, be an honest person. Don't ever make a promise that you aren't sure you can keep. The last thing you ever want to do is promise something to an artist just as a means to get them off your back, only to then have to go back and tell them you can't do it. Honesty is always the best policy, and they will respect you more in the end if you say no. If Dave Grohl comes to you and says, "I need you to make a 45-inch ride cymbal for me," and you say, "Sure, Dave, anything for you, no problem," and then you got to go back and say, "I can't do it," you're going to look like an idiot, and he's not going to respect you. He's going to feel like, "Well, this guy, who's your boss? I'm going to deal with that guy." And I think that's probably obvious, but it's always better to be honest with people. And I think that goes with, managing expectations. And even when it comes to signing people, if you can't sign, if you're an artist relations manager and your job is to sign artists, and you actually have that kind of authority where you can do it, explain to the person, if you can't sign them, explain to them why you can't, and at the same time encourage them to keep applying. You know what I mean? That's something that I would always do. I would never shut the door completely in someone's face. I would hope that maybe creating a dialogue would, and sometimes that didn't work. Sometimes they'd just go to the competitor and see what deal they could get, and that's fair enough. But hopefully you create enough of a rapport and a dialogue with that person that that maybe in 6 months or in a year, you're in a different situation with the company where you're opening it up a little bit more, and they're in a different situation with their band or their situation period, where you could say, hey, you know what, we can bring you on now at this level. So you haven't shut the door on that person.
John, thank you so much for spending your time with us here at DrumWise today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you for having me, and appreciate it. Stay safe.